Hi, this is Aaron. It's been a while. I usually script these, but I'm not going to today. I wanted to give you an update on Reimagining Liberty and to just apologize for the long delay between the last episode and this one. The short version is after 101 episodes of the show, if you count the bonus episodes, I'm bringing Reimagining Liberty to an end. The reason I'm doing this, though, is to make way for a new project that just launched and that I wanted to tell you about. It's a new show, although this one's co-hosted with my dear friend Jason Cannon, called The Inner Life of Liberalism. And it's something I've been building towards for a long time, arguably the whole of my scholarly and podcasting career. And it's a show that I think should feel familiar to those of you who've been listening to Reimagining Liberty since the beginning or for a long time, because it runs with a lot of themes that I've been developing here and in conversations with my guests, and in particular with the last episode of the show, which was with Jason Cannon and was on the topic of this new show. But the core idea is that liberalism is sure a set of rules and sure a set of institutions and constraints on those institutions and questions about government and policy. But it's also something more. It's a perspective. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of seeing the world and the people we share it with. And the inner life of liberalism is an attempt to build out what that looks like, what it is like to experience liberalism from the inside, what its perceptual posture is, what it means to be liberal and notice things, to register things as morally salient. It's about the experience of liberalism. And the argument that Jason and I make, and we've been building this in conversations together for at least a couple of years, but as I said, it's been a running theme in a lot of my own work, is that liberalism isn't just a political philosophy that makes the world better, but that the practices conducive to a liberal life make our own lives better as well. That being liberal leads to a kind of happiness and contentment, and it leads to a freer, more prosperous, more peaceful world. And that's what we explore in this new show, The Inner Life of Liberalism. I'm excited for this. I think this is one of the most important scholarly things that I've ever done. I am over the moon to get to do this with Jason. And so I wanted to just let you all know about the end of Reimagining Liberty, to thank you for listening over all of these years, and finally to just leave you with the first episode of the new show. So don't hit stop, don't jump out of this, just keep listening for the first episode of The Inner Life of Liberalism. And if you like what you hear, and I hope that you do, you can find it either at the link in the show notes or just search for The Inner Life of Liberalism in your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for all the conversations over the years, for listening to me, for being part of my project. I just have an extraordinary amount of gratitude for all of it. And I hope you'll follow me on to this new show. Thank you. Welcome to The Inner Life of Liberalism, a new podcast exploring how a better life and a freer world are built from the same practices. My name is Aaron Ross Powell, and I'm joined by my co-host Jason Cannon. Today's episode is an introduction to our Liberal Practices project, why we're launching this show, and what you can expect from future episodes. We're glad you're here, and we hope you'll join us on this journey. The backstory of this new show, Jason, I think is kind of interesting because you and I have both had our intellectual projects for a while, and we just realized over a couple of years of conversation that we had both been kind of working on the same thing or headed in the same direction or building the same project, coming at it independently. And then there was just a moment of like, oh, wow, we're working on the same thing. Can you describe from your perspective, like what that is? What is that thing that you and I have been working on and is now the foundation for this Inner Life of Liberalism podcast and broader liberal practice project?
I'm so excited about this. So my own thinking about this specific question actually dates back to a conversation that you and I had a couple of years ago now. And I remember us sort of thinking through this question around the communitarian critics of liberalism and the post-liberal moment that we're in, and how everybody complains that liberalism just doesn't have enough. It doesn't bring a theory of the good life. It doesn't teach people how to live. And a lot of people think that that's a real failing. And I remember saying in that conversation, it feels like there is a third element that's missing that is blank liberal democracy. And liberalism can't supply everything that people need to live a good, happy, free life. Democracy can't either. And there's a third element to this triad that is absolutely essential, but at the time I didn't know what to call that thing. And then you and I just did our own things for a long time. I was working on this dissertation on empathy in the 18th century, and none of it really seemed to sort of click until a few months ago. It was really at the beginning of this year, I think, where we were having a series of conversations at work about this kind of thing when I was your colleague. And then at the same time, I was really getting into this practice theory literature in sociology. And that highlighted for me what that third element is. And as I was thinking about it, I started to think of it in terms of integrative practices, the kinds of practices that don't just give us a coherent kind of inner life that supports our values and beliefs and aligns all of that with our actions, but then also does the same thing for liberalism. So that's the short version of this history. I'm curious for your version of why you've been thinking about this stuff lately, but then I'm also really interested to hear about why you've been thinking about this stuff for so long, because you've been thinking about it for a lot longer than I have. So give us the 2026 history and then give us the backstory of that.
Yeah, the conversations you and I have had, I think, helped clarify it for me. And it was this realization that a ton of what I've been writing over the last 4 or 5 years, a ton of what I have been podcasting about on Reimagining Liberty over the last 101 episodes of the show that I did, was all circling around this central concern, question, project, perspective, whatever you want to call it. And that was the phenomenology of liberalism, the practices of liberalism, as the title of the show, The Inner Life of Liberalism, is like what it feels like from the inside to be liberal. And I don't mean that in terms of like believing a set of policy prescriptions or a set of principles about the proper size and scope of government, although, that's part of the liberalism, but the way that a liberal perspective has you interacting with the world and sensing the world and experiencing the people in it, and the society that you live in, and how that influences the way that then you think about not just your own behavior, but what the government should do, what policies we should have, what makes sense, what seems morally permissible, what seems morally blameworthy, like how you want to live in this world and how you want the world to reflect a certain set of values. And so the inner experience of that. And I think that interest in that question grew out of an increasing recognition that most politics talk and debate, argument happens at this level of exactly that, of debate and argument. And it's like, I have principles, I can defend them. You have principles, I'm attacking those. You want policy X, I want policy Y. We hash out. And those, again, like that sort of analysis is really important. And policy talk is really important. I think more important than a lot of people think, because policy is wildly more complicated than most people take it to be. And so knowing how to have those kinds of discussions well and clearly is extremely important to participating in politics in an admirable way. But what I came to realize, and some of this was just having lived for a decade plus in Washington, D.C., and seeing kind of how national politics operates from the inside, watching people hold a certain set of views or express, at least rhetorically, a certain set of views and then behave in ways that ran contradictory to them. A lot of this like coalesced into this sense that those arguments are doing important work, but they're not really what's driving a lot of political outcomes, a lot of political beliefs and behaviors, but instead it is this underlying moral or ethical perspective. It is kind of what kind of person you are, how you see the world, what you notice as morally salient, what features of the world or society or justice or injustice seem beneath your notice. And that perspective is not innate, it's not fixed, it's to a degree trainable. And if we can train it, then even before we get to those policy arguments, we can be operating from a place that produces better results, that kind of tilts us towards better, more liberal results in our politics. And this was all happening at the same time that, I had been very, very interested in early Buddhist philosophy and moral psychology, and realizing, and I think this is what really clicked in the conversations with you and led to this particular project, is a realization that there are a lot of ways beliefs, behaviors, perspectives, fixations, and so on that we have that I think make us kind of miserable, or make our lives go worse, or make us interact poorly with others, lead to being antisocial or caustic. And it turns out that the way out of that also seems to point towards liberalism. That the perspective that I think brings a happier, more contented, more peaceful life also inclines us towards wanting that same for everyone else, and the way that plays out socially, politically, economically, and so on points towards liberalism. And so if I was going to summarize the project and kind of that realization of how all the pieces fit together, it is that it turns out, I believe, you believe, and what we plan to argue for on this show and explore the implications of, is that the perspectives and practices that lead to a better life for each of us individually also point towards, reinforce, shore up, defend a liberal society and a liberal politics.
I think that will strike some people as counterintuitive, or at least difficult to sort of understand intuitively, because it's not how we normally talk about that relationship. And I think one of the things that is motivating this project for both of us is that there seems to be a real divide in liberal discourse between focus on the principles and the institutions and focus on the inner life and the way that supports, and not only supports, but is affected by those principles and institutions. So maybe we should give folks a sort of concrete example of what we mean by this. You wrote an essay a while back, and in fact, this was the first real engagement that you and I had when we went deep on this, about sympathetic joy. Can you sort of recap your thinking about that?
Yeah. So the idea here is a common part of like liberal theory is that we need toleration, that a liberal society is a diverse society. It's a pluralistic society. And that means lots of people doing lots of different things and behaving in lots of different ways and pursuing lots of different kinds of lives. And many of those might be counter to our own tastes or preferences. And what liberalism means in large part is being tolerant of those differences, of not saying, I don't like them, and therefore I'm going to demand that the government put a stop to those people practicing that religion that isn't mine, or performing gender in this way that contradicts my preferences, or whatever it is. You're instead going to tolerate it and say, like, I'm going to live and let live. And that's absolutely right. You need that. But I think I wrote that piece, I've wrote that piece in the last several years, and kind of the rise of a liberalism, and a lot of people who had claimed to be liberal or support robust individual liberty kind of starting to draw lines saying like, well, no, that's too much. That behavior is too much. And what I realized is, everyone has some limit on what they will tolerate. All of us have a point where we say, okay, that has crossed the line and is no longer tolerable. And that's good. We should. There are behaviors that are intolerable. There are behaviors where you actually should step in and put a stop to them. But there were a lot of behaviors that for a lot of people were across that line that shouldn't have been, right? Like there's nothing wrong with someone changing their gender identity and living that way in public, and putting a stop to it is wrong and illiberal and bad and so on.
It's funny how many of these surround gender and sexuality. Those lines they are really, really concerned with especially women's bodies. Just as an aside.
Sure. And there's lots of interesting social cultural reasons for that. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we can explore in future episodes of this show. But my thinking on this was, what that meant is, if we can shift where that line is for people, we can have a more liberal society, or a stronger liberal society, because there will be fewer points of brittleness, or it'll take longer to get to the points of brittleness. And there's an idea in Buddhist philosophy called, so there's the four Brahma Viharas, or the divine abodes, or there's lots of different ways to translate it, but they're like really positive traits of character. And one of them is mudita, or sympathetic joy. And what sympathetic joy is the idea that you can take actual pleasure, find actual joy in someone else's experience of happiness. And the example you give is, as a parent, you might watch your child like succeed. They're playing Little League and they're doing really well. Their team is winning. And you are taking tremendous pleasure, like in their joy. And it's not that you're doing it because you're getting something out of them winning in some sort of instrumental sense. Like, boy, my kid doing well at baseball is going to reflect back on me and raise my status and so on. It is a more genuine, like, I am happy because of their happiness. And it's an extremely positive feeling. It's a wonderful feeling to have sympathetic joy for others. And it needn't be limited to relatives. You can watch, we all like, part of sports fandom is like getting pleasure in seeing your team win and feeling good for those guys who just won. And we can, there are versions of this all over the place. If we can couple that then to an understanding of a liberal society, we can get to something I think that's pretty powerful in a number of ways. So again, a liberal society is necessarily diverse because individual people choosing how they want to live are going to choose lots of different things. And it's necessarily dynamic. Like the set of people is always changing, the set of preferences, which means like the spread of what people are doing at any given moment will change in the next. Tastes, fads come and go. That for a lot of people is where toleration can break down. The country's not like I remember it. The kids are into music that's terrible and it makes me angry. They stopped making good movies after 1970 or something like that. But also like...
That's just objectively true.
We'll work on that, Jason. But they, this also shows up in like people that my town used to have fewer people of a different skin color than me. Or there's people speaking different languages or worshiping different religious figures, whatever it happens to be. And that's a necessary feature of liberalism. And toleration can break down there. But if instead you can get actual sympathetic joy in all these people finding fulfillment in diverse ways, so you can say, look, that person over there is living a kind of life it's not what I would choose. It's not what I necessarily want to participate in. But man, they seem to be really happy in it, and that's awesome. That's like I can actually share in that joy. And that this is happening over and over and over again, all around society, all around the world. That is a really powerful source of just delight in the world. And so cultivating that perspective, noticing these diverse actions, beliefs, behaviors, preferences, and so on as sources of pleasure for yourself, even if you don't partake in all of them, is good for you. It's like a way to find a source of happiness and contentedness in your own life. That's great. That makes you happier. But at the same time, if diversity is something that brings you genuine pleasure, then anyone who comes along and says, we need to stamp out diversity, we need to drive these people out, we need to return America to what it once was, it's not just that you might have a moral ickiness about that, but that person is telling you they want to take away one of your great sources of pleasure and delight in the world. And so it makes your commitment to dynamism and diversity, to pluralism, stronger, because this is something that you're getting something out of that's meaningful in your own life, that improves your own life. And so that's a long way of saying we need toleration, but if we can move beyond toleration to sympathetic joy, taken broadly across society, then our commitment to pluralism becomes much stronger. And in fact, we probably want to see even more of it because it's an endless source of delight. So yeah, I think that is an example of what this looks like, that you don't cultivate sympathetic joy because it's good for liberalism. You cultivate it because it makes you happier in the world. It takes away sources of suffering for you in the world. But a downstream effect is that it makes you more committed to preserving the pluralistic aspect of liberal society.
I think one of the challenges that will be really central to the kinds of conversations that you and I will have in the coming months, hopefully years, will be about this gap between the facts on the ground, where for most of the world, most of the time now, people have never been richer. They've never had more access to all of the things that we know help make a life go well. Much of the world lives in a condition of great political freedom, and despite the increasing authoritarian turn across so much of the world right now, a lot of people enjoy a lot more freedom and material well-being than they did 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago, right? Go back a few more 100 years and 80 to 90% of the world's population is doing some sort of subsistence farming. So like clearly things have gotten so much better than they once were. And yet people are still really unhappy. And if you went back to the 18th century and you told people about the incredible personal liberties that they would be given, that women would be able to own property and to have jobs and choose what they wore, that we would be able to cure diseases and like fly through the air and all of these things, right? They would be astounded, especially if they knew how much like actual wealth so many of us have. But we don't have that kind of happiness, right? We don't have the kind of happiness that I think they would expect that we would have. And that's, to my mind, one of the great puzzles of modernity, and is why I think that there's a whole set of things that can't be captured in market forces or political rights or democratic participation that gives life meaning and fulfillment, flourishing, eudaimonia. But here's something that you and I haven't talked about related to sympathetic joy that I think is relevant to this question, which is that if I were to develop that as a practice, if I were to get really good at taking joy from seeing others doing well, that's a real antidote to the kind of thing that I'm just highlighting, right? Because as material conditions and political conditions get better for more and more people, if I'm tuned into that and can genuinely take joy in that, my life is going to get better as people gain more prosperity and political freedom, right? As they get more agency in life, my own happiness is going to increase. So this strikes me as just one kind of practice that Buddhists have been talking about for a couple millennia now, that is actually really useful for playing with in modern times, for helping us think about these really deep-seated questions around personal fulfillment and personal well-being and social progress, and how those two interact, where they conflict, where some people are being left behind by social practices and institutions, and how we can fix that. But all of these are really tightly connected in ways that I think you're pointing to one good example of how just sort of like lifting that rock up and seeing what's underneath can expose a whole lot of roots that connect to a whole lot of really interesting places.
I'm wondering if you can talk about this in the context of your framing on it, which is the integrative versus disintegrative practices and perspectives. Because I've talked about it from like this, I'm coming at it from this kind of grounded in Buddhist philosophy and moral psychology, not, and this is something that's worth like flagging for kind of the conversations going forward. Like, this is not a, you need to be Buddhist argument, or even that you need to think that there's like Buddhism is true in some metaphysical sense. But rather, for me, and this is, like the part of that kind of intellectual development story of how did I end up here, and how did you and I end up sitting in this virtual room and recording this thing now, is that in studying Buddhism, it just proved profoundly clarifying on a lot of these issues. Like, it really helped me to see features of the world and ethics and psychology and kind of the way that we live that I think are there and real, and the diagnosis is correct, but it was a clarifying thing. So like the sympathetic joy is something we've all experienced. We all have felt that. You don't need to latch it on to, or it doesn't need to only be seen through a Buddhist direction. It's just that Buddhists happen to have like talked about this in interesting ways and thought about practices that can cultivate it and so on. So Buddhism is a lens for helping think about these issues, but this is not a like convert to Buddhism argument. So just having said that, I'm thinking about it though often through that perspective. you frame it up in this integrative disintegrative. So can you talk a bit about what that means? And maybe I gave the sympathetic joy example from like my side of things, like give a kind of example of what this looks like, what the analysis looks like from your direction.
Sure. So as I see it, at least in the West, the great social question that we've been grappling with for centuries now is, what does meaning look like in a post-Christian world? So we had this structure that was formed by actual institutions and a whole set of beliefs and norms that essentially ordered everyone's lives and gave everyone some kind of a sense of purpose. It answered a whole lot of questions about what life meant and how to live it. And then we lost that over time. I used to be one of those conservatives who thought that that was a tragic loss. And so the funny thing about this story that I'm telling is that in addition to thinking that it's the history of Western ethics since the Reformation, it's also very much a personal story about leaving religion behind and trying to find meaning after that. But I used to think, because I was a conservative, I used to think that that was a tragic loss. These days, I don't think that that's true at all. In fact, I think it's wonderful that we have so many different options and, different ethical lives that we can inhabit and try on. And Buddhism has been a source of real inspiration for us both. But at least in my case, I think of it more as a contemplative science rather than a religion. And it's a psychology, and that psychology has given me a lot of really useful tools. But that's just as true as CBT or Jungian psychology or anything like that. Epicureanism has been a real source of inspiration for me over the years. And I see Buddhism as being a more sophisticated version of those sorts of projects. But if that's right, that there was a sort of cataclysmic break in Western psychology after the Reformation, and I'm not the first to say this, of course. So many psychologists and sociologists sort of begin their theorizing with what it means to be human and a social being in this sort of increasingly secularized age. If they are right about that, and if I'm right in cribbing that from them, then I think that it points to one of the real challenges that we're facing today, which is sort of this. This is how it sits in my head, at least. And this is challengeable and revisable and probably wrong in a whole lot of ways. But around at the same time that we had this period that came to be known as the Enlightenment, when reason and refined moral sentiments were seen as a source of incredible analytical power. And at least in the case of the Scottish sentimentalists, who I tend to stan, a source of ethics that didn't need to rely on any sort of divine revelation or natural law or anything like that, but just began with where humans were and the sorts of practices that we picked up and found useful and then turned into some sort of ethical system. All of these are part of this period where people are just fundamentally reevaluating social life. And that's happening at the same time, partly because of all of the advancements in thinking that were happening during the Enlightenment, especially in the sciences. Massive amounts of prosperity were getting unlocked. Massive amounts of new ways about thinking about political freedoms were being unlocked as well. And those two things combined led to this really rapid social progress that means that our lives today are just fundamentally different than they were at the beginning of the 18th century. Now, that is a very quick version of several centuries of history that papers over and doesn't tell a lot of the really dark parts of that history on which so much of that was built. Last weekend, I was at the London Museum Docklands and was reflecting on how the commercial wealth that helped fuel so much of the English Enlightenment and so much of these like Enlightenment coffee houses and the kinds of things that we talk about was built entirely on the profits of the sugar trade, built on slaves in plantations in the Caribbean. And those stories absolutely have to be told together. So the story that I'm telling is not one about endless progress and a kind of Whig history where everything is getting better and we're getting richer and so we could just stop worrying about things. In fact, I think that that's one of the views that I want to push back on as firmly and as often as I can. But it does get us back to the thing we were talking about earlier, where we're a lot richer than we ever have been. Many of us have a lot more freedoms than we ever had. But that sense of a lack of meaning, I think, is still with a lot of us. And I don't think that those political and economic and social freedoms have supplied that. So it turns out in my little like sketch of Anglo, American, Western, European, however we want to describe this sort of like social development since early modernity, it just turns out that you can get a lot of things right and make a whole hell of a lot of improvements, and people won't be happier on a day-to-day basis. And not only will they not have solved a lot of personal problems around meaning, but some of that prosperity and some of that progress might actually start to work against meaning making. So I think here about like technology, which all of us increasingly have a real love-hate relationship with. On the one hand, the iPhone in my pocket gives me an incredible ability to communicate and be smarter and do all kinds of things that were impossible 50 years ago. And yet social media also often makes me angry and sort of brings out the worst in me. It brings out the status seeking bit. And sometimes I can just kind of be a dick because it feels good and people will like what I say and, share it with other people. We know based on the empirical evidence that things that make people angry get shared all over social media in ways that things that promote sympathetic joy, for example, don't. So I think we're left with this really strange moment where we've gotten so much of what we thought was important to get right about social life, and that hasn't filtered down into the kind of inner peace and tranquility, flourishing, whatever we want to call it, whatever the component bits are, that we might have thought would come along with that. And so as I'm thinking about the integrative and disintegrative practices, it's a question of all right, well, what would it look like if morally, ethically, psychologically, we had the same kind of progress as we've seen economically and politically since the Enlightenment? What would that have even looked like? How much better would our lives be if our moral lives had tracked all the rest of that kind of progress? And all right, it didn't, but what if we started today? What would that look like? What kind of conversations would we be having? What sort of books would we be reading and writing? And I think that conversations like this one, like the ones that you and I want to have with the authors who we'll have on this show, and the kinds of books that you and I will be reading together and the things that we'll be doing with this project, I think all of those are the kinds of things that you would do if that were your project. Sussing out the everyday activities, the habits, the virtues, the practices that can conduce to helping us understand what it means today to live a life well. And I think the only way that we get there is by asking that question directly and not expecting that other forms of social progress will answer it for us.
And that's where I think this show, at least what we aim to do with it, is quite different from a lot of, say, philosophy podcasts or political podcasts, is that our goal for it is that it's practical in addition to conceptual. I mean, we'll talk about all sorts of big and heady ideas and abstract things and principles and institutions and operate at that level, but we'll also operate very much at that level of what does it mean for you, the listener, but also for the two of us to put into practice the practices that we will discuss. What are the ways that these things can improve our lives? What are the things that we're doing now? You mentioned social media is a good example of this, that turn out to be making us less happy, making us more enraged, pushing us away from a contented peacefulness. And so people we talk to on the show will be people who are coming at it from that side as well, not just the grand political theory, high level, but here's what we know about what leads to greater happiness, what different traditions, what different empirical research tell us, what those practices look like. But what then also sets the show apart from like a wellness podcasts, say, is the tying it back into that bigger picture. It's the both halves. It's that these are practices that can help you, make you more ethical in your perspectives, make you happier in your relation to yourself and to the world, but also what those mean for the broader political and social project of liberalism. And hopefully we can defend our thesis that the two are quite intertwined, and getting better in one gets better in the other. And also the more liberal the world is, the more opportunities we have for these kinds of practices. So it's that feedback loop.
And am I right in thinking that both of us agree that that kind of ethical project is especially important right now, given the sort of political climate that we live in?
It's always been important. It's always, I mean, the traditions, the philosophers that we're drawing on for these questions about the good life and the practices that lead to it were doing this hundreds or thousands of years ago in societies that were extraordinarily different from the ones that we find ourselves in. And yet it's this common project with common insights because we're all human. So I don't want to say it's like this is just about the current moment from my perspective, but the current moment, I think, highlights the need for this, because you have the pushing against the kind of integrative practices and the kind of perspective we're talking about coming from multiple directions. You certainly have it in the political sphere as we're watching the rise and spread of authoritarian populism or fascism or just profound versions of illiberalism get traction in a way that they haven't in certainly either of our lifetimes. So we're seeing the fruits of illiberalism, that it's not kind of the meme stock images of happy pastoral families, but it's instead poverty and misery and cruelty and exclusion. So we have that need to meet the political moment with something effective and something that can steer us through it and set us up for a brighter, better future. But, and you mentioned the technology, at the same time, we're also living through a moment where I think a lot of us recognize these sources of anxiety in our own lives, these behaviors, these social patterns that don't make us feel better, that make us unhappy. And I think we recognize that the two sides are intertwined as well. We talk about the way that social media can, or the internet, or the kind of living in a very online lifestyle or an exclusively online lifestyle can lead to anger and loneliness, detachment and resentment and so on, and that manifests in a kind of unhappiness. We see this in research about, say, like the loneliness epidemic for men, or the issues that young people face in the world right now, that it's personally deleterious. But we also have compelling stories about how this is politically deleterious, that not just like operating in parallel, but that loneliness and kind of psychological damage that can happen then manifests in a certain kind of politics or pulls in a certain illiberal direction. So I think it's a holistic, comprehensive story. And it's one that has, as I said, like all of these features have been present going back. When I read early Buddhist texts written over 2,000 years ago, it's remarkable how much like they're describing things that I feel and you feel, and I'm sure our listeners feel. We haven't changed that much. But the current moment makes the need for this, I think, particularly acute and really clarifies the issues and the distinctions and the stakes.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just add a couple things to that. I think that we face a few different kinds of challenges now than we've ever faced before. And I think that makes this an especially important line of inquiry. So first, I think we live in a time where our technologies are just dramatically outpacing our ethical understanding. That's been true for a long time now. I think the nuclear age was really the clearest beginning of that point, but it certainly goes back really to the beginning of early modernity and to the way that we were using technologies to do amazing, incredible things, and then also get much more efficient in killing people and enslaving people and that sort of thing. But the nuclear age, I think, was the clearest point where now we have the ability to destroy everything. How wise are we? And are we wise enough to be able to use that technology and that power well? I think the leading challenge of our time, the nuclear threat is still very much around, but I think the leading challenge of our time is going to be AI and what we do with it and how we allow for it to shape our brains, reshape society, economic relationships, political relationships, that kind of thing. So if there were ever a time where we needed wisdom and discernment, it's figuring out how we deal with these incredibly powerful technologies and creating entirely new forms of intelligence. The other thing, though, that I think makes all of this especially timely is that we're living in a period when certain actors have figured out that disintegration wins elections. That if you can make people fearful enough and angry enough and anxious enough, and especially if you can do that towards an identifiable other, you can not only gain political power, but then you can pull the ladder up after you and take hold of those institutions in ways that allow you to retain power and restrict everybody's freedom for as long as your coalition lasts or as long as the institutions hold. And that, I think, makes practices that promote integration all the more important, because those are some kind of antidote to the kinds of disintegrative forces that we're getting on a daily basis from these new authoritarians. We can't do everything there, right? Like this can't be a story of us just finding our zen and that fixes the problem of authoritarianism. But all of us have to figure out how to live through this moment in a way that doesn't destroy our own inner lives, and at the same time allows us to resist in ways that are fruitful, both personally and politically. So I think that gives this kind of work a greater urgency, certainly than it had 20 years ago in my mind. But, even going back several hundred years, these kinds of problems feel new enough that it's probably worth us taking a second look.
Thank you for listening to The Inner Life of Liberalism. If you enjoyed the discussion, be sure to subscribe to get future episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to support the show and get special bonus content, you can become a patron at www.liberalpractice.org.